Today we are going to discuss how to frame and organize an argumentative essay. So the topic of the essay is, it is easier to preach than to practice. Write either for or against this statement. So your beginning should hook the readers. Here you can begin with a quote. Class 9 and 10 are very familiar with the famous saying of Portia in Act 1, Scene 2 of Merchant of Venice, especially when Portia tells Nerissa, "It is a good divine who follows his own instructions." End quote. So you can write, Portia in William Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice has rightly remarked, "It is a good divine who follows his own instructions." And then she goes on to tell Nerissa that she could easily teach 20 people than be one among those 20 people and follow her own teachings. So you can begin with this quote. It's a very relevant quote that you can use in this particular essay. So what Portia basically says is, it is definitely easier to preach than to practice what one preaches. And I absolutely agree to this view. So like I already told you in the last video, that right in your introduction, you have to mention your stance very clearly, whether you are for or against the statement, whether you agree or disagree. So in the beginning of this essay too, right in the introduction, you have to write something like, "And I absolutely agree to this view." If you do not write this, then your introduction is going to be incomplete. You cannot expect your examiner to read your introduction and just assume from what you have written that you support or you are against the statement that is given to you. You have to mention it very clearly. So let me repeat again. You can write something like, just like in William Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice, Portia has remarked, and then the quote, "It is a good divine who follows his own instructions." And then she goes on to tell Nerissa that she could easily teach 20 people what was good and what was to be done, than be one of those 20 people and follow her own teachings. Then full stop. It is definitely easier to preach than to practice what one preaches. And I absolutely agree to this view. This is your introduction. Now let me tell you something which is very important and which you absolutely should remember. Whenever you're quoting someone in your introduction or in any part of your essay, the quote has to be exactly as it originally is. You cannot change the punctuations. You cannot change any word within the quote. It has to be exactly like the original. If you are not sure of the quote, then do not write that quote. But do not write something assuming that this is the actual quote and then lose your marks. Do not do that. Especially if you are quoting a very famous text that is in your syllabus, chances are your teachers, your examiners, they will all be aware of the text, they will all be aware of the quote. So be very careful. Write the quote exactly as it originally is without changing any word or any punctuation within the quote. Now, since you have begun with divine, which is a clergyman with respect to the text, if you consider the context of the quote in Merchant of Venice, here Portia means clergyman by using the word divine. So since you're beginning with a clergyman, you can draw references from religion to prove your point. That can be addressed in the first paragraph. So think of today's religious or spiritual leaders. Think of the kinds of lives they lead, the kinds of scams they are involved in. Even though they preach the art of simple living extensively, even though they talk about living simply, simple living and high thinking and all that stuff. So think of all of that, and then think of the spiritual leaders of the past like Swami Vivekananda or Sri Ramakrishna, how they conducted their lives, what their beliefs and opinions were, and how different it is today, how different the gurus are today. So today's gurus are almost steeped neck deep in materialism. They lead very luxurious lives. They, roam around in very expensive cars, and their clientele consists of film stars and politicians and rich industrialists. They wear expensive jewelry. So you can understand how they are, right? They are steeped neck deep in materialism, yet they go around preaching people how to live a simple life, how to live without luxury and without expectations, how to serve people selflessly. So this is nothing but hypocrisy at its peak. So you can write about this. Your entire first body paragraph can address this one particular aspect, the religion aspect, and this is how you can elaborate on this aspect in order to justify your stance. In the next paragraph, you can talk about politicians. Now mind you, do not name any politician or any political party in your essay. Do not. Speak in general about politicians, about political parties, but do not mention any name. So when you are writing about politicians, write about what they preach, how they conduct rallies and tell people to live peacefully, stay united, whereas they themselves create divide and encourage communal hatred and subsequently riots just for their vote banks. They pose before common people as mass leaders so that they can connect with the mass. We see them entering poor men's cottages, sympathizing with them for their losses, eating out of their plates, promising to stand by them always. However, how many politicians keep their promises or live their lives humbly? Even if they do, someone close to them becomes a millionaire overnight. Now, we all know how that happens, don't we? But this is what politicians are. This is how they are. Power corrupts, and this is true for every political party in India. Yet, we look up to them as the leaders of the citizens. So this is what you can write about politicians, but be very, very careful not to name any politician or any political party while you're writing about it. Spend one paragraph solely on politicians, elaborating your point and amplifying how politicians do not practice what they preach. Next, you can write about parents. So parents, they teach us how to behave, they tell us what to do, what to avoid, but can they practice the same? Do they do the same things that they tell us to do? Do they avoid those things that they tell us to avoid? An alcoholic man tells his son to avoid addictions and even punishes him for it. Even punishes the poor boy if he is ever caught smoking or drinking alcohol. But the man himself is an alcoholic and drinks in front of his boy. A mother who tells her children not to get addicted to social media and scolds them very much if they are ever seen being active on social media, spends her whole day on Facebook and WhatsApp. She herself is addicted to various social networking sites. So, are they practicing what they are preaching? It's very, very easy to summarize, but very, very difficult to actually follow one's own sermons. If one really wants to teach, encourage, inspire, motivate, one should set an example first. Parents should give more quality time to their kids instead of punishing them or just telling them what to do and what to avoid. So here, in a separate paragraph, you're addressing the parents, you're amplifying how parents themselves do not practice what they preach. Spend an entire paragraph on it. You can quote from newspapers if you have found any incident similar to what you're trying to say. You can quote from any story that you've read or any movie that you've come across. But remember, when you are quoting from a source, your quote has to be exactly same, exactly similar to the original source. Even the punctuations, even the words. However, if you're not very sure about all the words that are used in the quote or the exact punctuations, what you can do is mention the source and then write the quote in indirect speech without the inverted commas. Write the entire quote in indirect speech. But whenever you're writing the quote within inverted commas, then please keep this in mind. Do not change the punctuation. Do not change any of the words. The quote within the inverted commas should be exactly like the original. In the next paragraph, we can move on to discuss what happens in schools. So in schools, teachers, the school authorities, they expect us to be kind, polite and forgiving always. They are always preaching moral values and there are occasional moral science classes. However, they themselves are not kind while dealing with students. It is often seen in newspapers and the television how students suffer at the hands of their teachers. Now, all teachers do not belong to this category, of course. There are some really kind and helpful teachers too. However, it is disheartening to read in the newspaper incidents like how a teacher has beaten up a student of the 6th standard or the 7th standard so ruthlessly that he had to be rushed to the hospital just because he forgot to carry his maths book to school. So you can mention something like this. You can mention some events that really happen in school that everyone can relate to when you're talking about schools and the hypocrisy of the school teachers and the school authorities. So this is how you go on framing your argumentative composition. In the next paragraph, you can probably talk about a very famous film star. A film star who is often seen teaching people environmental issues, making them aware about environmental issues, about the importance of planting trees. Yet, he himself has bought a large plot of forest land in the suburbs of Mumbai, got all the trees uprooted from there and converted the entire land to his new farmhouse. He has created a farmhouse out of that entire land, and that's why he has gone around uprooting hundreds and thousands of trees, whatever trees existed on that area. He has created a farmhouse out of it, a place to unwind. So the entire place, the entire forest land, the stretch of forest land now comprises a huge bungalow, outhouses, garages. Thousands of trees have been uprooted, they have been cut down, and the whole place is under brick and cement. So a film star who is going around making people aware about the environment, who is talking about the importance of planting trees, his own actions are so contradictory to whatever he goes around preaching. This can be a very, very valid point. But once again, do not take any names. Do not take any names even when you are writing about the schools. Do not take the name of any teacher. Okay, so maintain a sort of distance rather from whatever you're writing. Write in general. If you're quoting from some newspaper or you're referring to an incident, then you can be particular, but try to be general about it. Try to write about very true incidents, very relevant incidents that you often come across in real life as well as in the newspapers or the televisions. Now let's move on to how you can frame your conclusion. So in the conclusion, like I already mentioned before, you have to write in general about your general impression and what you've learned out of it, your experience, your realizations, how you've evolved as a person. These are the things that you should ideally be writing in the conclusion. But in the conclusion of an argumentative essay, you have to improvise, you have to be relevant to the topic, you have to write something that is relevant to the topic. Yes, you can write about your own realizations, you can write about your own observations, but maintain this very general attitude to the whole thing. Do not repeat anything that you've already mentioned. So you can write about there are many people who practice what they preach, but their number is too insignificant to be considered. They are a very small number of people. Mostly there's hypocrisy everywhere, especially people who are at the forefront, who are in a position to teach, to reach out to millions of people. They fail to practice what they preach, what they uphold. So this is everywhere. It's at home, it's in the society and in the country at large. You can see this everywhere. There's a huge gap between what people say and what they actually do. And then you repeat your stance. I therefore absolutely agree with the view that it is easier to preach than to practice. Repeat your stance and end your essay there. So the introduction has to be in general about the topic that you have been given. You have to mention your stance clearly in the introduction. If you are quoting from a source, then make sure you're quoting it exactly as it is in the source, especially if it's within inverted commas. If it's outside inverted commas, then you can write an indirect speech, but mention the source. Mention your stance clearly in the introduction. Then move on to the body paragraphs. In separate paragraphs, write about separate ideas, separate points, amplify separate ideas. Like in this composition, in the first body paragraph, you've talked about religious and spiritual leaders. In the second paragraph, you've talked about politicians. In the third paragraph, you've talked about school teachers. In the fourth paragraph, you've talked about famous film stars. So about different things you talk about in different paragraphs. You've also talked about your parents in one of the body paragraphs. So make very clear paragraphs talking about different ideas. Do not repeat your ideas or write about a politician when you're suddenly writing about a religious leader, or writing about parents when the paragraph is actually about school. Do not do that. Address each of these different institutions, these different groups of people in very different paragraphs. And then you move on to the conclusion, where you just state in general your general observation, your general impression about the whole thing, about the world at large, about your home, society, country, where you see instances of such hypocrisy. And then before you end the essay, repeat your stance. I therefore absolutely agree with the view that it is easier to preach than to practice. And then you end the essay. This is how you should be organizing and framing an argumentative essay. That's it for this video. Hope you learned something new out of this video. See you again in the next video.